The 1970s and 1980s were one of the most game-changing, culture-shifting, totally rad eras in American history. And let's be real, this era was fashionably insane. Big hair, neon spandex, shoulder pads, the size of small aircrafts. It was a vibe. But beneath all the glitz, glam, and aerobics tapes, the 70s and 80s were about change. America was reinventing itself, for better or worse. So today, we're breaking it all down. The moments that defined these decades, the trends that shaped culture, and the political shifts that still impact us today. Trust me, this is one history lesson you won't want to miss. So hop on and let's get right to it. There were four major areas across which huge changes occurred during this era of the United States. First, we'll be looking at the political and economic landscape. Stagflation of the 1970s. On the economic front, one of the earliest and most defining events of the 70s was stagflation. So look at this. Prices are skyrocketing, jobs are vanishing, and wages, yeah, they're not keeping up. That was stagflation, a nasty combo of stagnant economic growth plus high inflation, and it wrecked the 1970s economy. Here's how it happened. Normally, inflation and unemployment don't rise together. When one is high, the other is usually low. But thanks to a perfect storm of bad economic policies, global oil shocks, and failing industries, the 70s economy broke all the rules. One of the biggest triggers, the 1973 oil crisis. After the US supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the OPEC oil cartel hit back by slashing oil exports to America. Overnight, gas prices tripled and people were waiting in mile-long lines just to fill up their cars. And since oil fuels everything, from transportation to manufacturing, the price of everyday goods skyrocketed. At the same time, manufacturing jobs were vanishing. American factories, once the backbone of the economy, were shutting down or moving overseas, leaving thousands unemployed. The US dollar was weakening, and businesses were struggling to keep up with rising costs. Meanwhile, wages stayed flat, meaning even if you had a job, your money didn't go as far. The government tried to fix things with wage and price controls, higher interest rates, and stimulus programs, but nothing seemed to work. Stagflation lasted through the entire decade, making the 70s feel like an endless economic slump. A lot happened in the wake of this economic downturn, not the least of which was an era-defining political scandal. Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation. In 1972, five guys got caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in D.C. Turns out they weren't just some random burglars. They were connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. Sketchy, right? The more reporters dug, the more dirt they found. Secret tape recordings? Check. A White House cover-up? Yep. The phrase, "I am not a crook," becoming a national joke? Absolutely. By 1974, Nixon was drowning in scandal. Facing almost certain impeachment, he did something no other US president had ever done. He resigned. Yep, the most powerful man in the world straight up quit on live TV. Enter Gerald Ford, his VP, who became president and immediately pardoned Nixon, which made people even more suspicious. Watergate didn't just take down Nixon, it shattered trust in the government. Americans realized their leaders could lie, cheat, and steal, and suddenly people weren't so quick to believe what DC was selling. Political reforms followed, but the damage was done. You'd think America would have some time to process this mess, but no. The country took another turn, right out of the middle of a war, no less. Iran hostage crisis. Okay, imagine this. You're an American diplomat working in Iran, just going about your day, when suddenly, boom, you're taken hostage. Not for a few days, not for a few weeks, but for 444 freaking days. Here's what went down. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution overthrew the US-backed Shah, aka Iran's ruler, and let's just say the new government really wasn't feeling America. So when the US let the Shah come here for medical treatment, Iranian militants lost it. They stormed the US embassy in Tehran and took 52 American hostages. And for over a year, Americans were glued to their TVs, watching their country look helpless. President Jimmy Carter tried to get them back. Diplomacy failed, a rescue mission literally crashed and burned, and his approval ratings tanked. It was a disaster. But here's the wild part. On January 20th, 1981, just minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, the hostages were finally released. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe Iran just wanted to stick it to Carter one last time. Either way, America celebrated, and all was well, at least for a while. Rise of conservative politics. The 70s were a complete mess, so by the time 1980 rolled around, Americans were ready for a big change. Enter Ronald Reagan, a former Hollywood actor turned politician who came in with cowboy confidence and a message that really clicked: less government, lower taxes, and a return to traditional values. And just like that, conservatism took over. Reagan crushed Jimmy Carter in the 1980 election, and boom, the 80s were officially the Reagan era. His policies, dubbed Reaganomics, focused on tax cuts, deregulation, and boosting businesses. But Reagan wasn't just about the economy. He leaned hard into patriotism, amped up the military, and took a tough stance against the Soviet Union. Remember, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, classic Reagan moment. Culturally, Reagan's presidency fueled a rise in conservative values, things like family, religion, and just say no to substances. Spoiler, it didn't exactly work. But love him or hate him, there's no denying Reagan shaped everything about the 80s. And if you've ever heard the phrase trickle-down economics, yeah, this is where that came from. Here's the gist. Reagan believed that if you cut taxes for the wealthy and businesses, they'd reinvest that money, creating jobs, boosting wages, and helping everyone. Sounds great, right? Well, not so fast. Yes, the economy boomed in the 80s. The stock market soared, businesses thrived, and unemployment dropped. But here's the catch. While the rich got way richer, the middle class and poor didn't see much trickling down. Wealth inequality exploded. Another big part of Reaganomics, deregulation. Industries like banking, airlines, and telecommunications got way fewer rules to follow. Some people loved it, saying it fueled competition and innovation. Critics warned it led to corporate greed and financial instability. While Reagan cut back on a lot of government programs, his administration still spent tons on defense, both internal and external. A lot of wars were waged in this era, but the one that would define his legacy was fought without any weapons. War on substances begins. By the 1980s, America was facing a full-blown substance crisis. Substance use had surged in the late 70s, mostly among wealthy and middle-class users who saw it as a party substance. But then came a new type of substance, a cheaper, smokable, and even more addictive version, and it spread like wildfire, especially in low-income urban communities. At the same time, crime rates were rising, and sensational news stories showed images of dealers, gang violence, and substance houses, painting a picture of cities overrun by chaos. People were scared. The government needed a solution, and it responded with one of the harshest substance downs in US history, the War on Substances. President Ronald Reagan made the war on substances a top priority. In 1986, he signed the Anti-Substance Abuse Act, which dramatically increased penalties for substance offenses. The most controversial part, mandatory minimum sentences. Before this law, judges had discretion in sentencing substance offenders. After it passed, the law forced judges to give harsh prison sentences, no exceptions. And here's where it got even worse. Possessing just 5 grams of substances, about the size of a sugar packet, triggered an automatic 5-year prison sentence. But if you had powder substances, the more expensive form of the substance, often used by wealthier white Americans, you'd need 500 grams, 100 times more, to get the same sentence. The result? Substance was more accessible in poor neighborhoods, meaning those caught with it faced harsher punishments than wealthier white users caught with powder substances. By the late 80s, the prison population exploded. Between 1980 and 1989, the number of Americans incarcerated for substance offenses increased by over 300%. Entire communities were affected. Fathers, brothers, and sons were locked away for decades over small amounts of substances. Meanwhile, First Lady Nancy Reagan took a different approach: prevention. Her Just Say No campaign became one of the most famous anti-substance movements in history. The message? If kids simply said no to substances, they wouldn't get addicted. The campaign was everywhere. Schools showed anti-substance films, warning students about the dangers of substance use. Celebrities made PSAs telling kids to steer clear of substances. Even cartoons got involved. Remember the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and G.I. Joe preaching anti-substance messages? Looking back on it, critics say that while the campaign was well-intentioned, but let's be real, Just Say No wasn't enough. It ignored the deeper issues fueling substance addiction, poverty, mental health struggles, and lack of treatment options. On the other hand, fans of the war on substances believe that it would have been an even bigger success if the government only went harder against it, something very similar to what they thought about another one of this era's big wars, the end of the Vietnam War. After 2 decades of chaos, protests, and a war that seemed like it would never end, the US finally said, "Yeah, you know what? We're out." In 1975, American troops withdrew from Vietnam, and not in a victorious ticker-tape parade kind of way. No, this was a scramble. Helicopters frantically evacuated people from the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and within days, the city fell to North Vietnam. Just like that, the war was officially over. And let's be real, America was tired. The war had cost billions of dollars, thousands of American lives, and left the country deeply divided. Trust in the government? Pretty much at rock bottom. The whole ordeal made people question U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts, paving the way for a more cautious foreign policy moving forward. But Vietnam didn't just change war strategy, it changed culture. The anti-war movement had exploded, influencing music, movies, and even fashion. Think about it. Would the 70s have been as iconic without protest rock, peace signs, and rebellious youth culture? Probably not. And talking about protests, gay rights movement gains momentum. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the fight for LGBTQ+ rights was picking up steam. The Stonewall riots of 1969 had been a major turning point, and throughout the next 2 decades, activists were pushing for legal protections, visibility, and an end to discrimination. But this wasn't an easy battle. Far from it. The 70s and 80s were filled with both major victories and devastating setbacks for the gay rights movement. One of the most significant moments came in October of 1979, when over 100,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. for the first ever National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. This was a huge deal. It wasn't just a local protest, it was a nationwide demand for change. Activists called for laws banning discrimination, protections for gay and lesbian people in the workplace, and an end to police harassment. At the time, being openly gay could cost you everything: your job, your home, even your personal safety. Many states still had sodomy laws, which made same-sex relationships illegal. Hate crimes against LGBTQ+ people were common, and police raids on gay bars were still happening. But this march proved something big. The movement was growing, and people weren't going to back down. It laid the groundwork for pride events across the country and helped unify activists who had been working separately in different cities. As activism grew, so did LGBTQ+ visibility in pop culture. In 1972, the TV show That Certain Summer became the first ever American TV movie to depict a same-sex relationship in a sympathetic light. A few years later, in 1975, Saturday Night Live aired the first on-screen gay kiss on U.S. television, a bold move at the time. Then, in 1976, California's Harvey Milk became one of the first openly gay elected officials in the country. His victory was a major milestone, proving that LGBTQ+ people could hold political power. Sadly, just 2 years later, in 1978, Milk was assassinated, a tragedy that sent shockwaves through the community. Even with these cultural shifts, the fight for equal rights was still met with massive resistance. Not everyone was on board with progress. In 1977, singer and conservative activist Anita Bryant launched the Save Our Children campaign in Florida, working to repeal local laws that banned discrimination against gay people. She claimed that LGBTQ+ people were a threat to traditional family values, and sadly, her movement was successful. Several anti-discrimination laws were repealed. This sparked a wave of anti-gay legislation across the country, with several states trying to pass laws that banned LGBTQ+ teachers from working in schools. The most famous was California's Briggs Initiative, Proposition 6, in 1978, which would have banned openly gay teachers from public schools. Thankfully, activists fought back, and the initiative was defeated. Little did anybody know, the worst of it had only just begun for the gay community: the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Many still remember the 80s as the decade when the world faced one of the most devastating health crises in modern history: the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And let's be clear, this wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a cultural, political, and social earthquake that exposed deep fears, prejudices, and failures in how society treats marginalized communities. It all started in 1981, when doctors noticed a strange pattern. Previously healthy young men, mostly gay, were suddenly dying from rare infections and cancers. At first, no one knew what was happening. Some called it gay cancer, others the gay plague, and the stigma was brutal. Instead of treating it like a serious public health issue, many people saw it as a moral punishment, a disgusting and heartbreaking reaction that cost thousands of lives. By 1982, scientists had a name for it: AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, and confirmed that it was not just a gay disease. Anyone could get it, especially through blood transfusions, unprotected and intravenous substance use. But despite this, the government stayed silent. President Reagan didn't publicly mention AIDS until 1985. By then, over 12,000 Americans had already died. Activists were furious and they took to the streets, demanding funding, medical research, and a response from leaders who were ignoring the crisis. And it worked, slowly. By 1987, Reagan finally acknowledged AIDS as a major issue, and funding for research increased. Meanwhile, the epidemic devastated entire communities. Gay men, intravenous substance users, and hemophiliacs were hit hardest. Schools debated whether kids with HIV should even be allowed in class. Shout out to Ryan White, the brave teen who fought against this ignorance. And when celebrities like Rock Hudson and Magic Johnson revealed their diagnoses, it shocked the nation. Suddenly, AIDS wasn't just someone else's problem. By the late 80s, education and activism had started to shift public perception, but the damage was done. The crisis exposed homophobia, government negligence, and healthcare inequalities, and the fight for awareness and treatment would continue for decades. In the midst of that chaos, another silent fight was being waged, and won in the background. Women's rights advances. Women were making major moves in the 80s. For starters, more women were entering the workforce than ever before. We're talking double the number from the 50s, and they weren't just secretaries anymore. They were climbing corporate ladders, starting businesses, and proving they could bring home the bacon and fry it up in a pan. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The gender pay gap, still massive. Workplace harassment, common, and despite all this progress, the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, which was supposed to guarantee gender equality, still didn't get ratified. Yep, after decades of fighting, it fell short by 3 states. Brutal. On the bright side, pop culture was finally catching up. TV shows and movies started featuring strong female leads, and characters like Murphy Brown and Working Girl weren't just fictional, they reflected real women breaking barriers. Talking about pop culture, nothing was hip in the 80s than keeping fit and staying healthy. Fitness craze and aerobics trend. The 80s fitness craze all started with one person, Jane Fonda. If you were alive in the 80s, you either had her workout tapes or knew someone who did. Her 1982 Jane Fonda's workout became the best-selling home video of all time. And why? Because suddenly, working out at home was a thing. No need for a gym, just pop in a tape, do some high-energy aerobics, and boom, you were sweating with Jane. But it wasn't just home workouts, gym culture exploded. Gyms were popping up everywhere, filled with bodybuilders, yuppies, and fitness fanatics. And speaking of bodybuilders, let's talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger. His 1977 documentary Pumping Iron made weightlifting mainstream, and by the 80s, every dude wanted to look jacked. Meanwhile, running and jogging were huge. Thanks to the Nike boom, everyone was rocking Air Jordans and Reeboks, hitting the pavement like they were training for the Olympics. And speaking of trends, let's not forget jazzercise. It was part dance, part cardio, part fever dream, and people were obsessed. The fitness movement was everywhere. TV, movies, even cartoons. Remember Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling? The message was clear. Exercise was cool, but the fitness craze wasn't the only thing running the airwaves at the time. In the 80s, people were looking for change, and a lot of them would run to religion to find it. Expansion of evangelical influence. Megachurch pastor Jerry Falwell famously declared, "America's getting way too wild, and we need to fix it." And a lot of people agreed. This was the era of televangelists, big-haired preachers like Pat Robertson and Jim Bakker, who were raking in donations by preaching on TV. Their message? America needed to return to traditional values. That meant no abortion, no LGBTQ+ rights, and no corrupt influences in pop culture. And get this, these guys weren't just talking, they had real political power. Evangelicals helped get Reagan elected and influenced policies on everything from school prayer to sex education. Conservative Christianity became the cultural force of the decade. But as big of a force they were, they barely made a dent kicking against the face of the counterculture they picked as their biggest enemy. The rise of hip-hop and punk rock. Right in the midst of everything going on, two of the most rebellious, game-changing music movements of all time, hip-hop and punk rock, exploded in the late 70s and took over the 80s, shaping music, fashion, and culture like nothing before. First up, hip-hop. Born in the Bronx in the 70s, it started with DJs scratching records, MCs hyping up the crowd, and breakdancers spinning on cardboard. But by the 80s, it was unstoppable. Pioneers like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, Run DMC, and LL Cool J took rap from underground street parties to mainstream radio. In 1986, Run DMC dropped Walk This Way with Aerosmith, blending hip-hop and rock and blowing people's minds. Meanwhile, Public Enemy brought raw political energy, calling out racism and government corruption. Fashion, hip-hop changed the game. Gold chains, Kangol hats, Adidas tracksuits, shout out to my Adidas, and oversized boomboxes became the look. By the late 80s, rap had moved beyond New York, with NWA in LA, shaking the world with gangsta rap, putting police brutality and street life on full display in tracks like F the Police. But hip-hop wasn't the only genre flipping the music industry upside down. On the other side of town, punk rock was in full rebellion mode. Punk was fast, angry, and all about anti-establishment energy. Bands like the Ramones, The Clash, and Sex Pistols had kicked things off in the 70s, but in the 80s, punk got even louder and rawer. Enter hardcore punk, with bands like Black Flag, Dead Kennedys, and Bad Brains screaming about politics, war, and corruption. These guys played in sweaty basements, tiny clubs, and anywhere that would take them, because mainstream radio, yeah, they wanted no part of this chaos. But punk wasn't just music, it was a whole movement. DIY ethics ruled. People made their own shirts, their own concert flyers, even their own record labels. Skateboarding, graffiti, piercings, and crazy hair all became part of punk culture, influencing fashion just like hip-hop. And despite being complete opposites in sound, hip-hop and punk had a lot in common. Both were about rebellion, raw energy, and giving a voice to the unheard. Both were underground at first, then exploded into mainstream culture. By the end of the 80s, hip-hop was setting the stage for 90s rap legends like Tupac and Biggie, while punk was paving the way for grunge and alternative rock in the next decade. But that wasn't even close to all the entertainment industry had for us in the 80s. Star Wars influence and the sci-fi boom. I'll keep it real, Star Wars didn't just change movies, it changed pop culture forever. Before 1977, sci-fi was mostly low-budget, kinda cheesy, and super niche. Then, boom, George Lucas dropped Star Wars, A New Hope, and suddenly everyone was obsessed with space battles, lightsabers, and the ultimate villain, Darth Vader. The movie made over $775 million worldwide, which was insane for the time, and introduced blockbusters as we know them today. No Star Wars, no Avengers, no Jurassic Park, no Matrix, period. But it wasn't just about making money. Star Wars completely revolutionized special effects. George Lucas literally created industrial light and magic, ILM, just to develop new visual effects, and let's just say it paid off. Spaceships looked real, lightsabers actually glowed, and audiences were seeing things they'd never seen before. And then came The Empire Strikes Back, 1980, darker, more intense, with the biggest plot twist in movie history. Luke, I am your father? Yeah, that moment had people losing their minds in theaters. The 80s were a sci-fi explosion because of Star Wars. Movies like Blade Runner, 1982, Tron, 1982, The Terminator, 1984, and Back to the Future, 1985, all pushed visual effects and storytelling to new heights. And it wasn't just movies, sci-fi was everywhere. Toys, merch, video games, Star Wars turned fandom culture into a money-making machine. By the end of the decade, Hollywood had one mission: make movies bigger, louder, and more visually insane. And if you needed proof, just look at the rise of action movies and blockbuster sequels in the 80s. Boom of cable TV and MTV. Before the 1980s, watching TV was simple but limited. Most Americans had just a handful of channels, and networks like ABC, CBS, and NBC controlled everything people watched. If your favorite show wasn't on, too bad, you had to wait. If you missed an episode, good luck catching a rerun, but all of that changed when cable television arrived and completely revolutionized the way people consumed entertainment. The concept of cable TV had been around since the 1950s, but it didn't take off until the early 1980s, when companies realized they could offer the specialized channels catering to specific interests. Instead of just 3 networks deciding what you watched, suddenly there were dozens of new channels: news, sports, music, comedy, and more. This gave birth to CNN, ESPN, HBO, Nickelodeon, and most importantly, MTV. One of the biggest game changers was CNN, cable news network, launched in 1980. Before CNN, the news was something you watched for 30 minutes in the evening, and you only got what the big networks thought was important. But CNN, it was news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. People could now follow events in real time, which completely transformed how news was reported. During major events like the Iran-Contra affair, the Challenger explosion, and later the Gulf War, Americans weren't waiting for the evening news anymore. They were glued to CNN, watching history unfold as it happened. While CNN changed news, ESPN, entertainment, and sports programming network, which launched in 1979, changed sports forever. Before ESPN, sports fans had to hope that their favorite teams got coverage. But with a dedicated 24-hour sports network, people could watch games, highlights, and analysis whenever they wanted. By the mid-1980s, ESPN had turned sports into year-round entertainment, setting the stage for the massive billion-dollar industry it would become. Then came MTV Music Television, which launched on August 1st, 1981, and immediately changed pop culture as we know it. The first video ever played? Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles, and that title could not have been more perfect. Before MTV, music was something you only listened to, but now it was something you watched. Suddenly, image was just as important as sound. If you wanted to make it big, you didn't just need a hit song, you needed an iconic music video. This was a game changer for artists. Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Prince dominated MTV. Not just because their music was great, but because their videos were visually groundbreaking. MTV didn't just reflect pop culture, it created it. Fashion, dance moves, trends, if it was on MTV, it was cool. And let's not forget the genre-defining shows that MTV introduced. In 1988, the network launched Yo! MTV Raps, which brought hip-hop to mainstream America in a way that had never been done before. Before that, rap music was mostly underground, and most radio stations wouldn't even play it. But when MTV started airing music videos from artists like Run DMC, LL Cool J, Public Enemy, and NWA, hip-hop exploded into the mainstream. The fashion, the slang, the beats, it was everywhere thanks to MTV. MTV's influence didn't stop at music. It laid the groundwork for reality TV with shows like MTV's The Real World, which debuted in 1992 and set the stage for shows like Survivor and Big Brother. By the late 80s, MTV had turned into the voice of youth culture, influencing everything from politics to fashion to the ways people talked. Cable TV didn't just change entertainment, it changed advertising, sports, politics, and culture. Companies now had targeted audiences to advertise to. Politicians started running campaign ads on specific cable channels to reach voters. Kids had entire channels dedicated to them, like Nickelodeon and the Disney Channel, which meant they were watching more TV than ever before. By the end of the 1980s, cable television had completely transformed the entertainment industry, and there was no going back. It set the stage for the binge-watching, on-demand, channel surfing culture that we live in today. And while cable was the biggest thing to happen to entertainment in the 80s, another revolution was happening at the same time, one that was happening right inside people's homes. The tech industry, specifically the personal computer, was about to change everything. Rise of the tech industry. Life with no internet, no smartphones, no social media must have been wild, right? But in the 70s and 80s, we got the first sparks of the digital revolution. Computers used to be these huge, expensive machines that only businesses and scientists use. Fast forward to the 80s, and suddenly, personal computers, PCs, are showing up in homes, schools, and offices everywhere. It was the beginning of the digital revolution, and honestly, nothing would ever be the same. So, how did we get here? Enter two scrappy little companies you might have heard of, Apple and Microsoft. In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak built the Apple I in their garage. But it was the Apple II, 1977, that really put personal computing on the map. It was user-friendly, colorful, literally, it had color graphics, and became a must-have for tech nerds and early adopters. Then, in 1981, IBM dropped the IBM PC and things went to the next level. IBM was a massive, respected company, and their PC was seen as legit for business and personal use. But here's the kicker. IBM didn't own the software. Instead, they outsourced the operating system to a tiny company called Microsoft. Ever heard of them? Yeah, I thought so. Microsoft's MS-DOS became the industry standard, and by the mid-80s, they were everywhere. Then came Windows 1.12 in 1985, making computers easier for the average person. No more crazy coding, just click and go. Apple hit back with the Macintosh in 1984, featuring the first ever graphical user interface, GUI, and that famous 1984 Super Bowl commercial that basically screamed, "We're the future." At first, these computers were mainly for tech nerds and businesses, but then prices dropped, and suddenly, the personal computer PC revolution was on. By the late 80s, the stage was set for the digital explosion of the 90s and 2000s. Schools were stacked with PCs, businesses relied on spreadsheets, and nerdy kids who loved computers, yeah, they were about to become billionaires. The the PC era had officially begun, and tech wasn't just about computers. The video game industry was also blowing up thanks to companies like Atari and Nintendo, but we'll get to that soon. Video game industry growth. Atari, Nintendo, and arcade games surged in popularity, shaping entertainment. Finally, let's talk about one of the biggest entertainment revolutions of all time, video games. In the 80s, gaming went from a nerdy niche hobby to a full-blown pop culture phenomenon. Arcades were packed, kids were glued to their consoles, and 8-bit soundtracks became the background music of an entire generation. It all started in the 70s with Atari. Games like Pong, literally just a bouncing dot, and Space Invaders got people hooked. But the real explosion came with Pac-Man 1980. That little yellow guy took over the world, selling merch, inspiring cartoons, and even getting his own song. Pac-Man Fever, anyone? Meanwhile, arcades were popping up everywhere, filled with classics like Donkey Kong, Frogger, and Galaga. But then, disaster struck, the video game crash of 1983. Too many bad games, coffee tea for Atari cough. Too many consoles and a flooded market sent the industry spiraling. For a minute, it looked like video games were done for. Enter Nintendo. In 1985, they dropped the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, bringing gaming back from the dead. And with it came a certain mustached plumber, Super Mario. Super Mario Bros. Wasn't just a game, it was a revolution. It had smooth gameplay, colorful graphics, and catchy music that made kids obsessed. By the late 80s, gaming was everywhere. Nintendo ruled with The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, and Mega Man, while Sega entered the fight with the Sega Genesis. At the same time, handheld gaming took off with Game Boy and Tetris. Video games weren't just a fad, they were the future. And after the 80s, they only got bigger, better, and way more addictive. And boom, there you have it. The 70s and 80s, 2 decades that completely reshaped America. From the chaos of the Vietnam War and Watergate to the birth of hip-hop, video games, and personal computers, these years were anything but boring. We saw the rise of conservative politics, the fight for civil rights, and the power of pop culture turning everyday people into icons. But more than anything, these decades were about pushing boundaries. People were standing up, speaking out, and changing the world, whether it was in the streets, on the dance floor, or through a tiny 8-bit plumber named Mario. And here's the wild part, we're still feeling the effects today. The economy, politics, pop culture, it all connects back to the revolutions that happened in the 70s and 80s. So what do you think was the most iconic moment of these decades? Drop a comment below, smash that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history, culture, and the moments that made us who we are today. See you in the next video, guys.